History likes to imagine globalization as a European invention. Tall ships, ocean maps, gunpowder empires, a sudden knitting together of the world. But long before caravels crossed the Atlantic, long before stock exchanges and chartered companies, trade routes were already binding distant societies into shared systems of exchange. And ancient India sat at the center of many of them. When we think of ancient trade, we often picture isolated caravans moving slowly across deserts. What ancient Indian trade routes reveal is something far more complex. They reveal networks, institutions, shared standards, cultural blending. They reveal globalization before Europe. To understand this, we need to step back into the first millennium BCE. The Gangetic plains were filling with cities. Iron tools expanded agriculture. Surplus fueled urban growth. Markets emerged not just as places of barter, but as nodes in regional systems. Cities like Pataliputra became political centers, but they were also commercial magnets. Merchants organized themselves into guilds. Guilds regulated quality, prices, and reputation. They pooled capital. They funded caravans. This was not random exchange. It was structured commerce. By the time of the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka, roads linked distant provinces. Administrative records suggest careful attention to infrastructure. Security mattered. Way stations mattered. Trade was not an accident of geography. It was supported by the state. But land routes were only part of the story. To the northwest, Indian merchants connected with Central Asia and the Mediterranean world through the vast network we now call the Silk Road. This was not a single road. It was a web of caravan routes stretching from China to Rome. Indian goods traveled outward. Silks and horses traveled inward. Ideas traveled in both directions. Coins found in archaeological sites tell the story. Roman gold coins appear in southern India. Indian beads and textiles appear in Mediterranean contexts. Money crossed borders, and when money crosses borders, systems interlock. Maritime trade pushed even further. Monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean follow predictable seasonal patterns. Ancient sailors learned to read them. They did not hug the coastline in fear. They crossed open water. Ports on the western coast of India linked with Arabia and East Africa. On the eastern coast, ships connected with Southeast Asia. What this reveals is confidence, navigation skills, shared maritime knowledge. The Indian Ocean became a commercial highway, not dominated by a single empire, but sustained by cooperation and competition among many. Merchants from different regions did business using common practices. Weights and measures showed patterns of standardization. Contracts were honored across cultural lines. This is one of the clearest signs of globalization. Trust beyond tribe. Trust beyond language. Trade routes also carried religion. Buddhist monks traveled along the same corridors as merchants. Monasteries often rose near trade routes. They offered lodging. They offered legitimacy. In return, merchants donated. Trade and faith reinforced each other. The spread of Buddhism into Central Asia and East Asia did not happen in isolation. It followed commercial arteries. Religious art from Gandhara shows Greek stylistic influence. Curly hair, draped robes, realistic facial proportions. This was not imitation, it was fusion. When artistic styles blend, it means communities are in sustained contact. Ancient Indian trade routes reveal that globalization is not just about goods, it is about shared aesthetics, shared technologies, shared stories. Consider textiles. Indian cotton fabrics were highly prized abroad. Fine weaving techniques became known far beyond the subcontinent. Demands shaped production at home. When foreign demand influences local labor, you are looking at economic integration. Spices followed similar patterns. Pepper, cardamom, and other aromatics moved westward. They were not luxury curiosities. They became embedded in distant cuisines. A kitchen in Rome might depend on produce grown in Kerala. That is interdependence. Trade routes also reveal migration. Merchants did not simply travel and return. Some settled abroad. Communities formed in port cities across the Indian Ocean. These diasporas maintained ties with home regions. They transmitted language and custom. They adapted to local norms. Globalization requires brokers, people who can move between worlds. Ancient Indian merchants became such brokers. We also see evidence of technological exchange. Shipbuilding techniques evolved as sailors learned from one another. Astronomical knowledge improved navigation. Mathematical concepts traveled as well. Systems of numeration and calculation did not remain confined. The idea that ancient societies were self-contained collapses under this evidence. What about politics? Trade wealth influenced power. States that controlled ports grew strong. Taxation of commerce funded armies and monuments. But no single empire monopolized the Indian Ocean for centuries at a time. Instead, the region functioned as a multipolar system. Multiple states, multiple cultures, shared commercial logic. This resembles modern globalization more than early European colonial monopolies. Even conflict did not end exchange. Rival polities competed, but merchants often continued their work because profit incentivizes continuity. One of the most striking features of ancient Indian trade networks is their durability. They persisted through political change. Empires rose and fell. Routes adjusted. Globalization in this context was not dependent on a single hegemon. It was sustained by geography, wind patterns, economic desire, and institutional memory. Guilds played a stabilizing role. They could outlast rulers. They maintained standards. They enforced contracts. This institutional continuity is another marker of globalization, systems that transcend politics. Cultural exchange left traces in language. Loan words moved across regions. Scripts influenced one another. In Southeast Asia, inscriptions reveal Indian cultural influence. Political concepts, religious ideas, and artistic motives traveled across the Bay of Bengal. But influence was not one-directional. Indian society absorbed foreign elements, too. Greek communities in northwestern India left marks on coinage and art. Central Asian groups shaped political structures. Globalization is reciprocal, not a one-way export. What ancient Indian trade routes reveal most clearly is scale. Scale of distance, scale of coordination, scale of imagination. Merchants planned voyages months in advance. They calculated seasonal winds. They navigated unfamiliar ports. This required knowledge networks. Information about prices, demand, and risk traveled alongside goods. If pepper prices rose in one region, production adjusted elsewhere. Market signals crossed oceans. That is not primitive exchange. That is integrated commerce. The environment itself became part of the system. Monsoon cycles structured trade calendars. Communities timed harvests and departures accordingly. Nature and economy synchronized. European expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries did not create Indian Ocean trade, it entered it. When Portuguese fleets arrived, they encountered established networks. Ports were busy, contracts were familiar, competition already existed. Europe's later dominance would reshape these systems, but it did not invent connectivity. Ancient Indian trade routes show us that globalization is older than modernity, older than colonial empires, older than the Atlantic world. They reveal that economic interdependence can exist without global political domination, that cultural blending can flourish without forced assimilation, that networks can be decentralized yet coherent. They also reveal limits. Participation was uneven. Benefits were not equally distributed. Some regions prospered more than others. Globalization has always created winners and losers, but the existence of inequality does not negate the presence of integration. When Roman coins accumulate in Indian hoards, it signals sustained exchange. When Indian artistic styles appear in distant temples, it signals shared imagination. When merchant guilds operate across linguistic boundaries, it signals institutional sophistication. These are not isolated curiosities. They are pieces of a connected world. Ancient Indian trade routes remind us that the past was not static. It was dynamic, interlinked, adaptive. Before European ships rounded Africa, caravans and dhows were already shrinking distances. Globalization is not a modern rupture. It is a reoccurring pattern. And in the ancient world, India was not peripheral. It was pivotal. Not because it controlled everything, but because it connected so much. What these roots reveal is simple and profound. Human societies have long sought connection, long sought exchange, long built systems that outgrew their origins. The world was global before it was called global, and the winds of the Indian Ocean were already carrying that truth across the horizon.